Episode 21, Blood on the Prairie. The riders came hard through the darkness, their silhouettes emerging from the settling dust of the storm like phantoms given flesh. Sarah counted 8 men spreading wide as they approached the Thornton homestead, their movements coordinated despite the poor visibility. 8 riders, James called out, his voice carrying to every position. Hold your fire until I give the word. Make every shot count. Sarah's hands were steady on the rifle, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Beside her at the eastern window, she felt Daniel's presence at the adjacent position, his breathing controlled and even. The storm had passed, leaving the air thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth and ozone, but the clouds still obscured the moon, rendering the prairie a landscape of shadows and uncertainty. "They're stopping," Samuel Thornton observed from the northern window. 100 yards out. The riders had indeed halted, forming a loose semicircle facing the homestead. For a long moment, nothing moved except the wind stirring the wet grass. Then one man urged his horse forward, stopping 50 yards from the house. "We're looking for James Mackenzie," the man called out. His voice carried authority, educated, Eastern. Not the rough speech of hired guns. "We represent parties with legitimate business interests in this territory." James moved to the door, but didn't open it. "State your business from where you stand." "The mining claim you filed is under dispute. There are irregularities in your homestead documentation that call into question your right to file on Crown land. We're prepared to offer fair compensation for the property and avoid lengthy legal proceedings that will leave you destitute. The only irregularities are in Cornelius Blackwood's fraudulent liens," James replied. "We have legal counsel and documented evidence. You're trespassing on private property after dark. Turn around and conduct your business through proper channels." A different voice answered, rougher, impatient. "We ain't leaving without what we came for. You got 2 choices. Take our money and walk away, or we take what we want and you don't walk anywhere." "That would be murder," Eleanor called out from the southern window, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Multiple witnesses, multiple families, you'd hang." "Accidents happen on the frontier," the educated voice replied. "Homesteads burn, families perish in fires. Tragic, but not uncommon. Or you could accept $3,500 and start fresh somewhere safer." Sarah felt cold clarity settle over her. These were the men who had murdered 3 families. Families with children, with dreams, with futures stolen in flames and buried in lies. Her finger moved to the trigger guard. "Last chance," the rough voice said. "We got more men than you got bullets." "Then you'd better hope your arithmetic is better than your legal knowledge," James said, "because the first man who advances gets buried on this prairie." For 3 heartbeats, nothing moved. Then the educated man raised his hand and dropped it in a chopping motion. The riders charged. "Fire!" James shouted. The night exploded with gunfire. Sarah sighted on the nearest rider and squeezed the trigger, felt the rifle buck against her shoulder. The rider jerked sideways but stayed mounted. She worked the lever, ejected the spent cartridge, chambered another round, fired again. Beside her, Daniel's shotgun roared, closer and louder than the rifles. One of the riders went down, his horse screaming and wheeling away. Samuel's rifle cracked from the northern window, steady and methodical. More answering fire came from the southern side, where Eleanor and Martha held position. The riders scattered, some diving from their horses to take cover behind whatever terrain offered shelter. A slight rise, a depression in the ground, the water trough near the barn. Others wheeled away, firing from horseback with wild inaccuracy. But not all of them. 3 riders pressed forward, charging directly at the house through the storm of defensive fire. Sarah tracked one, fired, saw him flinch but keep coming. 20 yards now. 15. James stepped through the door with his rifle at his shoulder, completely exposed, and fired 3 times in rapid succession. The lead rider tumbled backward over his horse's rump, dead before he hit the ground. The second veered away, clutching his shoulder. The third fired as his horse reared, a snapshot in poor light that should have missed everything. James staggered backward, his rifle clattering to the floorboards. "Papa!" Sarah was moving before conscious thought, but Daniel caught her arm. "Stay at your position," he ordered. Then he was crossing the room in 3 strides, dragging James away from the door and kicking it shut. Eleanor made a sound, not quite a scream, something rawer, but her shotgun never wavered from the window. Samuel had shifted to cover the door, his rifle trained on the darkness beyond. The third rider never made it to the house. Johann Schmidt's rifle spoke from somewhere near the barn, where he and Peter Reed had taken hidden positions as a second line of defense, and the man pitched forward, sliding from his saddle as his horse bolted. The remaining riders retreated, their charge broken, dragging one wounded man with them. Their covering fire was sporadic now, disorganized. They'd expected an easy target, not a fortress defended by people who knew how to shoot. James! Eleanor had abandoned her position, crossing to where Daniel knelt beside her husband. Sarah took over the southern window, her hands shaking now, but her aim still steady. James was conscious, his face pale in the lamplight. Blood spread across his left side, soaking his shirt. "I'm all right," he managed, though his voice was tight with pain. "How many down?" "2 dead for certain," Samuel reported, still watching the darkness. "Maybe 3. They're regrouping." Eleanor had already torn open James's shirt, revealing the wound. The bullet had taken him high on the left side, below the ribs. Blood welled steadily, but not in spurts. No major artery hit. "Martha, I need clean cloth and whiskey. Sarah, keep that window covered." "I'm fine," James insisted, trying to sit up. Eleanor pushed him back down with surprising force. "You're shot and bleeding, and you'll lie still while I work," she said, her voice shaking, but her hands steady as she wadded cloth against the wound. "Daniel, hold pressure here. Samuel, what are they doing?" "Pulling back," Samuel answered. 200 yards now, but they're not leaving." Sarah watched the distant shapes through the window, her heart still racing. They'd survived the first assault, but James was wounded, and the night was far from over. Movement caught her eye, a figure running low from the direction of the barn. "Someone's coming from the barn," she called out, rifle ready. "Don't shoot!" Johann Schmidt's German-accented voice carried through the darkness. "Is Peter Reed?" Samuel opened the door just enough for Peter to slip through, then slammed it shut again. Peter was breathing hard, his rifle in one hand. "Got one of them," he reported. Johann's still watching from the loft. They're talking out there, arguing. Sounds like they didn't expect this much fight. "How bad is James?" Samuel asked. Eleanor had packed the wound with cloth soaked in whiskey, her movements efficient despite the tremor in her hands. "Bullet went through," she said. "Missed anything vital, I think, but he's losing blood. We need to get him to a doctor." "Medicine Hat's 2 hours away," Daniel said quietly. "In the dark, with those men out there." "We ain't going anywhere tonight," James said through gritted teeth. "They'd pick us off on the trail. We hold until dawn, then Samuel and Peter make a run for town." "You need a doctor now," Eleanor insisted, but Sarah could hear the fear beneath her mother's steady voice. They all knew what infection could do, how quickly a survivable wound could turn deadly. A shout came from the darkness. "Mackenzie, we're leaving, but this ain't over. You can't stay barricaded forever." Samuel moved to the window. "They're mounting up, all of them." Sarah watched the riders gather their dead and wounded, their movements hurried now. They'd lost at least 2 men, maybe 3, and gained nothing. The educated voice called out one more time. "You've made powerful enemies tonight. The law won't protect you. Your claim will be tied up in courts for years. And accidents still happen to stubborn men and their families." Then they were riding away, heading south into the darkness. The sound of hoofbeats faded gradually, swallowed by the vast prairie silence. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Thomas began crying from the corner where the children huddled, and Martha went to comfort him. Eleanor continued working on James's wound, binding it tightly with strips torn from a clean sheet. "We hurt them," Samuel said quietly. "They didn't expect that, but they'll be back, and next time they'll come differently." "Next time we'll be ready differently," James said, wincing as Eleanor tightened the bandage. "But first we need to know they're really gone. Johann should keep watch from the barn. The rest of us stay alert until dawn." "You're not giving orders in your condition," Eleanor said firmly. "Samuel and Daniel will organize the watch. You're going to lie still and not tear these stitches I'm about to put in." Sarah met her mother's eyes and saw the fear there, barely contained beneath the competent exterior. James had been shot. The consortium had shown they were willing to kill. and the nearest doctor was 2 hours away through hostile darkness. Daniel's hand found hers briefly, squeezed. "We held them," he whispered. "We're still here." But as Sarah looked at her father's pale face, at the blood-soaked cloth beside him, at her mother's shaking hands as she threaded a needle by lamplight, she understood that surviving the night was only the beginning. The consortium would regroup, would come back with more men or different tactics. And James needed a doctor, needed one soon before infection set in, before the wound that looked survivable became something worse. Outside, Johann's voice called softly from the barn. "They are gone south. I can see their dust in the starlight." The clouds had begun to break, revealing patches of stars. Sarah stared out at the prairie, at the dark shapes of the fallen riders still lying where they'd died. 2 men dead, maybe 3. The violence she'd witnessed, the violence she'd participated in, would stay with her forever. But so would the knowledge that they'd protected their home, their family, their future. The consortium had learned tonight that the Mackenzies and their allies would not be easy victims. Eleanor began stitching the wound, her hands steady now despite everything. James gripped Samuel's hand, breathing hard through the pain, but not crying out. Martha comforted the children while keeping one eye on the windows. Daniel and Peter checked their ammunition, preparing for the possibility that the riders might return. And Sarah stood at her window, watching the prairie gradually emerge from darkness as the clouds cleared, knowing that when dawn came, someone would have to make that desperate ride to Medicine Hat. Someone would have to bring back a doctor before her father's wound turned fatal. The question was whether they had enough time and whether the consortium would let them make it. "Sarah," her father said softly. She turned from the window to find him looking at her, his face drawn with pain, but his eyes clear. "You did well tonight. I'm proud of you." She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. He'd been shot defending their home, their future, and now that future hung in the balance, measured in hours and miles and the uncertain mercy of time. Eleanor tied off the final stitch and covered the wound with clean bandaging. "That's the best I can do," she said quietly, "but he needs proper medical care. Soon." Dawn was still 3 hours away, 3 hours of darkness, of waiting, of watching her father's face for signs of fever or delirium. 3 hours before someone could risk the ride to town. Sarah returned to her window, rifle ready, and watched the prairie for any sign of returning riders. Behind her, she heard her mother's quiet voice as she spoke to her father, heard the murmur of prayers from Martha's corner, heard the wind picking up as the last of the storm clouds moved east. They'd survived the battle, but the war was far from over. And now they were fighting on 2 fronts, against the consortium's next move and against time itself as infection threatened to claim what bullets had not. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and merciless under the emerging stars. Somewhere out there, the consortium's men were regrouping, planning their next attack. Somewhere closer, Henry Blackburn maintained his solitary vigil at the Mackenzie homestead, unaware of the night's violence. And here, in this fortified soddy on the Thornton claim, a family held together by will and desperation waited for dawn, for help, for the chance to fight another day. James's breathing had grown steadier, but Eleanor never left his side. Sarah watched them together, her mother's hand on her father's forehead, checking for fever, her father's fingers wrapped around her mother's wrist, and understood that some battles were fought with rifles and some with simple refusal to let go. The night wore on, measured in heartbeats and prayers and the slow rotation of the stars overhead. And when dawn finally came, painting the eastern sky with bands of gold and crimson, it would bring with it a reckoning, the ride to Medicine Hat, the desperate race against infection, and the consortium's next move in a game that had already cost too much blood. But that was for dawn. For now, they held their positions, kept their vigil, and counted the cost of defending what was theirs.